I want to ponder something with you today, a few thoughts. The sermon title, Survival of, and then ... And I don't think you have to be an Einstein to fill in survival of the fittest, following those dots. That's what I think we have been conditioned to, and that we accept as being the phrase that is appropriate to be completed with the fittest. It's the famous phrase that is attributed to Darwin. When he did this monumental work that I think changed so much of the history of the world and humanity. The phrase was actually first used by a colleague of his, by Herbert Spencer. Spencer, who wrote a book around the same time as Darwin published his first Origin of Species, that edition. Spencer's book was The Principles of Biology. And in that book, he suggested that Darwin used that phrase, survival of the fittest. Darwin seemed to warm up to the idea, and in his fifth edition of The Origin of Species, which he published in 1869, he used that phrase and he explained what he understood under that phrase, with that phrase. And let me read that to you. Survival of the fittest means for him that organisms will survive when they are better designed for an immediate local environment. That is what the phrase meant to Darwin. I think the phrase has been used and abused for many things over time. One use of it, one function or role that it fulfilled, I think, was to add scientific proof to the way of thinking that all life, including human life, is about perpetual competition. That it is one brutal slog, almost combat, endlessly, and that only the meanest and the strongest and the one with the longest teeth and the one that carries the biggest stick and that can use it the best, that they are the ones that make it in nature and also make it in life. And it, as I said, it was taken as scientific confirmation for a brutal, competitive view of life, a binary view of winners and losers, and the winners surviving, getting the spoils of life. I hear some echoes of that in when we look at COVID, the herd immunity approach. You know, when we say, all right, the virus should spread and everybody should get it as much as possible, and there will be a natural thinning out of the population, and in the process, the whole population will become immune. What is, I think, conveniently left out of the conversation is, according to the epidemiologist, depending on which scenario you accept as valid, that between 2 and 13 million people in the US alone would have to die before we perhaps reach herd immunity. Something of that cold, brutal approach of survival of the fittest. And in our case, in the US as elsewhere, but in our case specifically, the population that will be culled in the process are mostly the elderly or the vulnerable. And it's not because I have some gray on my head as well that I will object to it. It is just, for me, brutal. And I think it reflects a view on the phrase that Herbert Spencer coined for Darwin that is imbued with meaning foisted on it. That phrase was taken and a view of the world was imposed on it. Another view on Darwin's work has been emerging slowly and often in muted terms, because it is not popular to go against one of the gods like Darwin. For instance, one anthropologist from Princeton, Agustin Fuentes, he specialized in primatology, but he did wonderful work on evolutionary anthropology, saying that through the evolutionary process, because the neurological default state of the brain, of the human brain, is one of being prepared for social interaction. And therefore, the human brain and the human body have adapted and integrated characteristics where the social is everything. He describes it in an interesting way, quoting another evolutionary biologist and anthropologist, Michael Tomasello, who says, when a fish is born or comes into the world, it is expecting water. When a human is born, it is expecting the social and culture. And on the basis of this and other research that has been done in biology and other related fields, there has been results and data emerging that collaboration and cooperation is a critical part of the evolutionary process, also for humans. And Tomasello puts it in a rather humorous way. He says, it is not as if humans through our evolutionary process have been running, holding hands, running through the clover and frolicking in the clover, and through the daisies, most of our evolutionary history. Now he says, we often hit each other over the head. But on average, he says, those who keep on hitting the other over the head, they just didn't do so well as those that cooperated and those that collaborated. And these anthropologists and biologists, evolutionary biologists, go further, and looking at human nature also says, because we have been through evolution wired now, and we have this brain that is set on social interaction, says the pandemic is therefore extremely hard. The consequences of social distancing, of less contact, of less, for instance, hugging somebody else or just being touched by somebody else, Some go so far as to say that it is doing damage to our brains and to our very bodies. They didn't say anything about wearing a mask, but I think if you are inclined to search, you will find something. But let's leave that conversation there. Now, I've talked a lot about that simple phrase, survival of the fittest. What does that have to do with Advent and with our theme of peace? As the house family that we welcome to our virtual community today in the service, as they lit the candle for us, they said it is the candle of peace for the second Sunday of Advent. Advent, a time of preparation, a time of anticipation, where we prepare ourselves and we anticipate the birth of Jesus that we commemorate and the coming of Jesus into our lives today, here and now. In this time that we live in this time of social distancing, of the hard slog through the pandemic, and our lapses in our vigilance, often with a lack of leadership and the terrible consequences in the rising number of infections, hospitalizations, and death. An anticipation of the coming of Jesus and the peace of Jesus. I started off with that phrase because I think our understanding of peace has also been influenced and actually determined by, and I want to say impoverished by, a so-called Darwinian understanding of reality and of life and of human nature. I think it is essential for us as Christians and as rational human beings living in a scientific era to at least consider that there may be a different meaning that could and should be read into that phrase. So that survival of the fittest could perhaps mean better designed for the local environment, but also being more responsive and open to the local environment. Because I think a more responsive organism has a better chance of surviving into the future. I think that our understanding of peace, at least up to this point, has much to do with the view that all life, and especially human life, is about competition. And that there are winners and losers, as I've said. And that peace is actually only achieved when two sides that have been in competition and at war with one another have fought each other to a state of exhaustion and agreed, all right, we can't carry on, we first have to take a break, therefore let us have peace. Or peace is achieved when one side becomes so dominant that the other side says, can't keep it up, I have to surrender, I ask that we make peace. So peace is, in the traditional or the conventional understanding, I think, very much tied to violence in one or another form. It is about victory achieved in an atmosphere and a climate of violence and achieved through violence. It is about control. It is about enforcement. That is not the biblical view of peace. The biblical view of peace, Old and New Testament, is not a situation that results from violent enforcement and of victory through superior violence, but it is a peace that is the result or the outcome of justice prevailing, of harmony that exists, of compassion reigning, of equality. And I think if we look at what the data reveals, what research reveals nowadays as well, about our inherent programming, our true nature as collaborative creatures, as people or as creatures who want to cooperate, as creatures who, in their essence, are not creatures that prefer to do the negative, that are by nature and by preference inclined to harm the other, to commit violence. I think it is time to consider that in terms of the biblical peace, that peace is only sustainable in the long run if we make it our serious business to adapt or to adopt the view of our sacred text and of our tradition about peace. I've spoken a lot about how we are programmed and about peace. And I want to return to the passage that Ed read so well for us, that passage from a translation that is known as the Message, which I think for the most part is a good translation. And I think in this particular passage, Jesus is speaking about something that is captured well, I think, by the translation, where he speaks about the sword, because that verb used to describe the division created is actually about a sword and making a cut with a sword. A fierce cut splitting something in two, in more or less equal parts. And the same verb is used in the Greek, other places in the New Testament, to indicate divisions into two parts that are normally more or less equal in strength. Jesus says, there will be divisions, because my peace and my justice requires a decision to be made. It requires commitment. And where I disagree with the translation is where it says all these cozy relationships. Jesus was not speaking about cozy relationships. I think a better translation would be the established or the accepted nature of relationships. Because Jesus was speaking about the structure of the core family in a very patriarchal society, where there was a lot of oppression and violence built into the structure, also of the core family, but in society in general. And Jesus says, it is like a sword that makes a cut that separates and divides. He says, walk with me, make the choice for me, make the choice for my justice and my peace. There should not be compromise on that. It is like a sword cutting and separating. It is like a sword separating so that the true nature of relationships, that the true nature of the structure of society can be revealed. He was speaking in a time of the Roman Empire, running the lives of Israel, the empire being extremely oppressive, and the empire ruling the world through the cold blade of the Roman sword, enforcing peace through utmost violence. And Jesus stands up and says, that is not peace. Peace achieved through violence and oppression. No, peace should result from compassion and from doing justice. And to that I want to invite you on this second Sunday of Advent, where we think about peace, around a sermon titled Survival of the Fittest. That we should consider the demonstration of Jesus speaking about a sword making that cut, cutting through pretense, cutting through fluff, so that the true nature of relationships and the structures of society can be revealed. Inviting us, like I spoke a few Sundays ago about getting into the boat, being with Jesus, where there is no compromise when you are in his presence. Let us, on this Sunday, the second Sunday in Advent, around the theme of peace, contemplate that the truth should not be survival of the fittest as it has been understood in that brutal, perpetual, competitive way. But perhaps we should consider the alternative, that we, on this Sunday in Advent, consider not the survival of the fittest, but rather the flourishing in abundance of all life, fully living in God, in God's Spirit, with the spirit of compassion and justice being done, so that a sustainable peace may prevail for all life, also for human life. May God's Spirit lead us to that place, to that peace. Amen.